Day here on day one of the G20 Summit. It was indeed a very busy day yesterday before the summit even began with those high-level talks between President Biden and President Xi Jinping of China. But now we're properly underway with some level of comfort from the international political community that US-China relationship seems to be on the mend. The focus really shifted today to talk of pressure on Russia over its actions in Ukraine. There were very strong words from the US President, from the UK Prime Minister, and some European leaders too, urging other G20 leaders to get behind their call to ramp up the pressure on Moscow for an immediate de-escalation of military activity in Ukraine. That was added to by a video address from the Ukrainian president himself, Volodymyr Zelensky, who said that it was imperative that Russia pulled out of Ukraine immediately. He outlined an exact plan that he wanted Russia to follow to make that happen. This has resulted in a unified voice, effectively, within the G20 to put pressure on Russia to do so. There is a communique being prepared that has been shown to parts of the media here in a draft version, which shows that most of the leaders here are all in agreement that there must be an end to Russia's actions as soon as possible, not just for the political good of the world, but also for the economic good, particularly for developing countries and particularly for African nations who are facing fuel and food shortages as a result.
Absolutely. Now, we know that South Africa is represented at the G20, but was looking to agitate on behalf of the African continent for the AU to get some sort of permanent representation within the G20. Do you know anything about talks in that regard?
Certainly, there's a growing voice, not just from South Africa, but also from international political commentators for that to be the case. They say that really the time has come for Africa to be better represented. There is what's being called an observer post being made available this year for African Union representatives here at the summit, but there's still no permanent seat outside of South Africa for the African continent. I spoke with South Africa's International Communications Minister, Grace Pandor, on Monday about this issue. She said really the time has come for there to be more developing country representation across the G20 and particularly for African countries. To a certain extent, South Africa bears the burden in a way of representing so many countries here when it has to share the voice of the needs of all of the African continent. She said that's particularly acute when it comes to talking about military disputes and territorial disputes, because although the focus is so heavily on Russia and Ukraine today, she said, of course, there are still ongoing disputes in Africa that are equally difficult and equally problematic and really do need international support to find a resolution. And she wants to make sure that those get discussed as well, if not this week, then potentially next year when the G20 moves to India. So that's a real pledge from the G20 here, particularly because it's being hosted here in Indonesia, a less developed country relative to many of those in the G20. And the president here, Joko Widodo, has spoken many times about his will to try and make sure that this summit of any summits is the one in which developing countries get a proper voice.